Welcome and good morning, good evening, good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are at this present moment in time. My name is Renee Musai. I'm the Senior Curator and Head of Curatorial and Collection here at Autograph in London. It's my great pleasure to introduce this talk today, which forms part of the international season of Photo Life, presented in partnership with Photo Australia and Photo 2022, the forthcoming International Festival of Photography in Melbourne. Photo Life is supported by the British Council as part of the UK-Australia season 2020 to 2022, and it is a collaboration between the British Council and the Australian government's Department of Foreign Trade Affairs and, sorry, I got that slightly mumbled up, the Australian Government Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, forgive me. And Autograph's work is supported by public funding from Arts Council England. The idea behind this collaborative series of talks is to facilitate a creative, intellectual, artistic exchange between artists and curators based here in the UK and in Australia. Hence, each talk features one artist from one country in conversation with a curator from the other country. And the series in total comprises 10 online conversations that explore, through engaged and open dialogues, a range of pertinent ideas around diaspora, identity, culture, memory, post and decoloniality, difference and different conditions of existence. Importantly, these conversations are framed in the context of human rights, representation, justice. There's some kind of a sound coming from somewhere. Okay, I'll just continue. As such, the program foregrounds the importance of centering Black, Brown, Indigenous, feminist, queer, and other crucial and often still unheard voices and modes of storytelling in photography and lens-based media. The 5 British artists we selected from Autograph all feature in our current group exhibition titled Care, Contagion, Community, Self and Other, which is currently on view at our gallery in London. So if you do find yourself in the UK and London, please do come and visit us. It's on until February 2022, so there's plenty of time. So this morning or this evening's talk will last about 45 minutes. And feel free to leave questions, any questions that you may have at any time during the Q&A using the chat function. And if you like to access captions, please click close captions and select subtitles. This is an ongoing program. It will continue until the end of this month, so please do also join us next week for talks with Atong Atem and Othello de Souza Hartley. For this session today, we are joined by artist Mohini Chandra and Shivanjani Lal, artist and independent curator. So just I'm going to read both of their bios briefly before I hand over. So Mohini Chandra's work deals with articulations of identity in globalized spaces and the role of the photographic in relation to history and migration. Her research-led practice is fueled by a sustained interest in photographic histories and the processes of visual culture within colonial, anthropological, and ethnographic discourses, often exploring significant global sites of collective and personal memory, emphasizing the experience of colonialism and its aftermath. We at Autograph have a long-standing relationship with Mohini, one that we're very proud of, that dates back to the early 1990s, including a wonderful past commission, which we often mention. It comes up, Mohini, literally in almost every other conversation that we have curatorially. So we always return to the brilliant album Pacifica, an installation and book project, which evidences your deep engagement with ancestral histories and the lived experiences around family, migration movement, and the Indian Fijian diaspora. And the project is held in the Arts Council collection, I believe. I hope this is correct. Yes. And most recently, for our latest commissioning project, Care, Contagion, Community, Mohini created a beautiful, soothing, thought-provoking visual mediation on notions of place and belonging entitled Belated, which I believe you will be speaking about a little more in a bit. And when we were installing the exhibition, my colleague Bindi Vora and I often literally sat in front of your installation and just listened to the voiceover and the visual, and it just gave us this beautiful, soothing, balm as we were working on the show. So thank you for that. And the piece is online as well on Autograph's website. And your work has been exhibited globally, including at the Blue Coat Gallery in Liverpool, the Whitechapel Art Gallery, the Center for Contemporary Photography in Melbourne, and many other places in New York. And all over the world, including at the I think the inaugural Johannesburg Biennial in 1995, and festivals in India and America, etc., to name but a few. And Mohini will be in conversation with Shivanjani Lal, who is, we're meeting for the first time today. Shivanjani is a Fijian Australian artist and curator whose work in many ways, as I understand, shares a lot of similar sentiments with Mohini's work. So there's a lot of shared history there, and tied also to a long narrative and engagement with movements across diasporas and matters of family and memory, often using personal grief to account for ancestral trauma, loss and healing. Shivanjani works interdisciplinary, and a fundamental concern in her practice is how art develops and represents culture as it transitions, whilst also probing in particular the experiences of women in such situations of flux and exploring migratory histories from the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Shivanjani was the recipient of the 2019 Create New South Wales Visual Arts Emerging Fellowship and a 2020 Studio Artist at Parramatta Artist Studios. And I will now hand over to Shivanjani. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you both here, and enjoy. I'm looking forward to your conversation.
Thank you. So I was thinking, Mohini, about when we first met, and I was thinking about how I reached out to you. I think it was around 2015. I think I reached out because you were the first person that I'd ever met that was also Indo-Fijian and an artist. And I think when I was reflecting on this, I guess one of the sightlines of this conversation around contagion and care was this idea of how, as a younger artist, what I really needed were peers, but what I also really needed were elders. So it feels really emotional to be having this conversation with you, and being able to share with a wider community about what does Fijian art look like, particularly of women from South Asian descent from Fiji. So I'm super excited to talk to you, and yeah, I can't wait for people and to kind of open up this conversation. So would you like to share some of your work with us?
Yes, I would. Thank you very much, both of you, for that lovely introduction. And just to say, I was also delighted when you did reach out to me all those years ago, because I thought, I'm not alone anymore. So
Yeah.
it was really nice. And since then, you know, projects that you've done, which we might talk about later, have actually led me to feel there's a younger generation and there's a sense of community coming through that, which is really exciting. And that certainly wasn't the case when I was emerging as an artist, but I'm not sure about the elder. It makes me feel old.
So,
But,
I mean,
yeah, I know what you mean. It's all right. Thank you. But anyway, I will share my screen, and we'll see if I can cope with technology.
I'm sure you can.
I'm not too old. And I'll go to my presenter view now. Right, okay, can everyone see that? That's looking all right. Good, okay. Yeah, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about my work and the work that I've made over many years and leading kind of up to the present moment. And we will hopefully get to talk about Belated, the project that I did recently for Autograph. So just to really contextualize my practice, just to mention before I start that there are some images from ethnographic collections of both First Nations and migrant people, which may be troubling to some of you, but I hope that I'm using them wisely and contextualizing them in line with my work. So just to let you know that. In fact, the first image that I'm going to show you is from a book called The Hill Tribes of Fiji by A.B. Brewster, photographed by the studio photographs by Waters from the late 1890s that have been used in a missionary book, kind of showing the before and after. So these were made in Fiji in a studio, sort of to show the effect of missionary presence on indigenous Fijian people, the civilizing presence. You'll notice the image in the on the right, the man, his skin is lighter, he's wearing a sulu, a skirt, he's got a hibiscus in his hair. So yeah, he's almost been feminized, and that's a version of him being tamed. But obviously we can see that these are studio constructions made with props and costumes and, you know, a kind of dressing up box of what was thought to be Fijianness at the time. And as my dad came from Fiji, he's part of the Indian diaspora community in Fiji, I was very, very interested in these photographic histories and this kind of earlier forms of photography. Oh, it's my colleague, it's my work office. And so I've been looking at these ethnographic images from collections and books all around the world, as well as family photographs. And a lot of my early work was about the contrast between these two forms of description through photography. One stereotypical, hierarchical, I felt, in terms of race, making the other, the racialized other, primitive in a way, and reinforcing that kind of stereotype. The Indian community, on the other hand, emerged in the Pacific, in Fiji in particular, through the indenture system. So I don't know if any of you know very much about that, but basically it was a form of slavery that was deployed by the British Empire to transport workers from India to other parts of the world, in Africa and the Pacific and elsewhere, the West Indies, to work in the sugar industry, which was growing at that time. And it was felt that while the Fijian culture needed to be preserved in some way, the Indian culture, there was this sort of stereotype around coolies, and that these people in a way could be transported from one part of the world to the other regardless of their own wishes or desires. And in my family there were all of these stories about workers being actually tricked. There's this idea of trickery, and that people thought they were going to an island just off India, and they ended up halfway around the world. And the term for the indenture that you had to do was gurmat, or agreement, and you had to basically do this for 5 years, and then you could earn your passage back over another 5 years. But actually very few people did that. And so what I found in my family was that the link to India was lost, and the knowledge about specifically where my father's family had come from was lost. And it was a community cut off from an imaginary homeland in some ways. In terms of photography, what I started to find were images, very few images actually, in Fiji itself. And I wondered why this community was relatively invisible compared to the high visibility of indigenous Fijian populations at that time. And compared to, say, photography in India, which was extensive and was part of a kind of military and administrative project of cataloguing all the types of people, all the castes of people, all the different trades of people in India. Where I did find images, they were quite exotified, and they're quite, you know, they're sort of quite orientalist in their tone. And I wondered about this silence, and it was kind of a mystery to me, and I started kind of doing research in that area. And I've returned to that work over and over the years. And a few years ago, I did a residency in Paris looking at the collections of the Musée du Quai Branly, which has a really great ethnographic collection of photography. And there's lots of critiques around the museum. They have reorganized recently. They are kind of trying to open up the collections in new and interesting ways, but I still found evidence of some interesting practices going on in terms of the display. But it was interesting that they allowed me in as an artist, and they knew that I was going to try to reinterpret the collection or interrogate the collection in some way, and they were very helpful about that. And what I decided to do in the end was to abstract the images from the archive rather than show them as they were. We know these images of measuring and of stereotyping are problematic. You know, we know what they do to people. They are dehumanizing. They're part of a system of using photography to create a kind of racial hierarchy, to map the evidence of difference on the body. And if any of you have kind of looked at the writings of John Tagg and people like that over the years, you would have probably explored this area in photographic theory. So I found various ways of doing this. I was experimenting in the archive, and I came up with this idea of just sort of softening and blurring the images in camera and abstracting them in a way to turn them into a photograph of a photograph rather than reproducing the photograph itself, which in many ways would be quite problematic, I think. And this idea of anonymity and absence and not showing something is something that I think has permeated a lot of my work. It fascinates me that photography, which purports to show and reveal things, can sometimes not reveal something, and what is not shown to us is often more interesting than what we can see. So one of my main kind of investigations has been about my family and our diaspora. So it's a complicated double or maybe triple diaspora, in that I was born in London, but we came over to Australia via Fiji and America, and Canada and New Zealand, where other parts of my family had dispersed to. So Indians from Fiji subsequently migrated to other parts of the world, finding Fiji, I think, over the years quite hostile. You may know about some of the coups and other things that have happened there, which were felt to be by the community quite anti-Indian. My father said he grew up with a sense of, there's always this conversation about Indians will be sent back to India. So I'm not saying that that's a universal opinion, but it was something that I think my father's generation grew up with, and it's something, a story that he passed on to us. His family of 12 brothers and sisters, most of them have migrated now to other parts of the world, or their children have migrated. And so I started kind of trying to map that experience of those complicated double diasporas throughout the world, and, you know, including my own travels throughout this diaspora, trying to gather information. One of the things that I was gathering were photographs from studios. So Indians took over studios in Fiji that had been left behind by Europeans, and they set up new photographic studios as a kind of business, and in the cities like Suva, for example. And my family were cousins, our cousins were the Prasad brothers, who had about 4 or 5 studios. They had a little empire around the main island. And I got really into this history and really fascinated by the way that the community expressed its sense of itself. It performed its own identity in this very fluid and open way through photography, through belonging to this space and yet also not belonging to it. And in some ways, the fantasy beach was a safer space in the studio than it was in reality outside in the real world, I think, for this generation particularly. And so there was a lot of this kind of dressing up, and it kind of mirrors photography that was going on in India at the time as well, which is quite interesting. And the sort of intervention into the photographic surface, the creation of a dreamscape that is your life, looking back at yourself, belonging to a space of home, but also projecting yourself outwards, as my father's generation did, traveling from Fiji outwards into the world. And, you know, he was one of the first sort of Asian students, I suppose, to come to Australia and study at Queensland University, him and a small group of his friends. And they were novelties at the time, you know, and they got a pretty good reception most of the time because they were so novel. And, you know, he had many fascinating stories to recount. So I have this history, you know, being told to me all the time about migration and movement, both forced and voluntary, I suppose, throughout my family history. So I started to look at the surface of the pictures and the materiality of the image, the way that certain pictures had almost faded away. And this is a very small image that fits in the palm of your hand. And you can see there's 2 figures sitting here. You just about make them out, but they've almost vanished. And I think with old film and analog photography, it was printed on a surface very often, and there was a great possibility that the image would be destroyed or the negative would be destroyed, and there'd be the wear and tear of what's happened to this image over the years started to almost imitate or be a metaphor for the migrations of people themselves as they traveled. And I was really fascinated by this. So I started to make my own interventions into the surface. And then looking at the way that images were installed in Indo-Fijian homes throughout the world. And this one is in Canada. My cousin photographed this because she wanted to paint the wall and then put the pictures back in exactly the same space. So she was curating her own collection, you know, and and really quite precise about the way these images were organized. So all of the wedding pictures might be on one wall, all of the graduation pictures on another wall. And I found these practices really interesting. And at this point, I was almost becoming like a kind of anthropologist doing field work and going into people's homes. And sort of the first thing that would come out would be that photographic albums. And people say, that's your dad. And, you know, it was just great. And I think there's quite a difference when you're part of a community and you're also reflecting that community to the world, or trying to understand it. I think it's a different sensibility. And this work became Album Pacifica, which was very kindly mentioned before, which showed in the Bluecoat Gallery. And it was pictures of 100 pictures of the backs of photographs, which I hand printed and mounted as an installation. And then this became a book, which was published by Autograph in 2001, gosh, a long time ago. And the lovely thing about this book, whereas the installation was obviously meant to mimic those installations that I'd seen in people's homes, when it came to the book, I was returning them to a sense of the family album. So thinking about the way that they're arranged. It was almost an imaginary album because people had been sending me photographs from around the world, or I'd collected photographs, and I had this kind of archive in my house. And I basically recreated the album, but only showing the backs of the photographs. And that's the significant thing. And this is what I mentioned before. Sometimes it's good not to show everything. And in this case, I didn't show the photograph at the front. I just showed the writing and the inscriptions on the back and the photographer's stamps, which obviously alluded to this history of the studios in Fiji. What you'll notice, sorry.
I just wanted to kind of sort of pause and reflect on that and kind of think about like this sort of notion or investigating into like, how do you remember through forgetting? But also I was thinking about I was recently in London and going to my aunt's house, and it was a Fijian Indian house, and it was because of the objects in that space. And one of the things that I keep thinking about, in particular in relationship to like Album Pacifica, is that we've sort of turned the backs, like seeing the backs of images provides this sort of space for our ancestors, maybe like to kind of keep existing. And I was just wondering about this space of refraction, or this space of returning, because I keep thinking also about and I'm sure we'll get around to it, your work in Paradise Lost. And the thing that I found really amazing about that work was the reflections in that work. And maybe that like reflection or refraction was a way to also speak to our heritage as people who have been removed multiple times.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think reflection and refraction has come into my work even more since this period. You know, when I made Album Pacifica, I was becoming aware of the idea of memory being very partial and things being lost, you know, information being lost, stories being lost, people being lost. And that if someone leaves their home, they are absent, they are no longer there. There's a space where they once were. And you know, it's that loss and sadness that I think this work is thinking about in some ways.
Yeah. But I think there's also like a reclamation that's happening in it as well, you know, like very clearly you are making choices. And I was thinking about the word reclamation and about how I keep thinking about it in the context of Bombay, which is an island, like is an archipelago, but was actually filled in by the British. And the idea of land reclamation is about filling in the gaps. And this, like in many ways, Album Pacifica is about filling in the gaps but not sharing everything, you know,
and it's about bringing images together as if you're creating a family reunion. And either on the wall or in a book, like a photo album. And if you imagine a family reunion, everybody would be telling stories. They would be partial. People would get the facts wrong. Somebody would remember something differently to somebody else. And I've been fascinated by that, you know. And it is like that. There's all these voices talking, and they're all crisscrossing each other with partial memories. And somewhere in there is our truths, you know, our real lives. I mean, I wouldn't have really known about indenture if I hadn't heard my father's stories. but they're very anecdotal and they're being passed down from generation to generation.
I think
And that,
I was thinking that I never grew up understanding what indenture was. I mean, I grew up going to my grandmother's farm and thinking about it, understanding that it was a sugarcane farm, but it wasn't really until I was much, much older that I realized that actually it was a plantation, and that this conversation ruptured for me. And I was wondering if that was an experience that you ever had, like this idea of rupturing.
Yeah, I think when I went to Fiji, possibly my last visit a few years ago, and I went to the sugar plantation area that my ancestors worked on, and I filmed in a large refinery that's no longer used, it's disused, but some other factory things going on next door. So you've got this like industrial noise, but this empty space. And the scale of it, the size of it, and the, really was a moment when I understood the scope of this enterprise and the number of people that were involved, and how massively life-changing it was for individuals as well as a whole community,
Yeah.
and the fact that a vast number of people were cut off from their roots and their own communities, and how disruptive that was. It really brought it home to me, I think. But if I carry on, I'll show you some images that might sort of help. So yeah, and this work, which I won't go into too much, I basically removed images from my father, I searched for all the pictures I could find of my father in the family albums, and removed them and used the backdrops that I've been photographing in Fiji of the in the studios, this sort of fantasy kind of painted backdrops and photographic backdrops. And so I created this space where this is it could be my father. I mean, it is for me, but for you, it could be someone else in your family. So I hope there's a space in my work where people can imagine themselves in the pictures, or when they look at Album Pacifica, they imagine their own family pictures, because a lot of things about family photography are very typical throughout different cultures. Within the family, there are certain kinds of pictures we all have, which is a wonderful thing. And so, yeah, but it was experimenting with removing my father, that image of him coming home to visit and staying in his old childhood bedroom when he was actually studying in Brisbane at that time. And so he's there, but he's not there at the same time, and I think there's a state in the mind of someone like my father who was always in two places at once, probably, and always slightly absent. And then, I started making moving image work quite early on, and in this Travels in a New World, which is also at the Bluecoat Gallery. So it was the same time that I made Album Pacifica. I'd been around the world using Super 8. In those days, the technology was so basic. I used Super 8 with sound and then had to transfer it onto video. And basically, I filmed as many of my father's brothers and sisters as I could find. And they're all kind of living around the Pacific Ocean, even though they're in Canada and America and New Zealand and other places, in Australia, obviously. They were somehow near the Pacific Ocean. And so I took them to the nearest bit of ocean and filmed them talking. And they were all remembering a family photograph that they all remembered it differently, of course. But that in the installation, they're all talking at once. So again, it was this idea of an imaginary family reunion and all these garbled voices. It's basically like having all your aunties and uncles in the room at the same time. So that was
I guess without the food.
Without the food, sadly. Yeah, that's right. And that strand of using moving image to investigate still photography is something that has really, I think, come through my work consistently as well. In this one, I filmed in the studios in Fiji with people actually just before they had the photograph taken, and during the photograph being taken, and just after. And of course, my favorite moment really was just before. This is like a pregnant pause when the studio is empty and you're waiting for people to come in, stand there and have their picture taken. So this started really, yeah, my interest in using kind of moving image to think about still. And then we come up to a work like Cow Street, which is probably 2016, something like that. And this was in CCP de Clare's at the Centre of Contemporary Photography in Melbourne, which many of you may know. And this was a show called On the Social Contract, which is a triennial survey of Australian photography. So that was really lovely to be included in that. Having shown kind of in many parts of the world, but not very much in Australia. It was a great honour to actually show at CCP. And yeah, so in this work, I'd been able to go back to Fiji again, and having worked through a lot of these research ideas for many years, I felt a kind of sense of freedom, and I really like the kind of new eclecticism of contemporary photography as well. So I sort of included images of the backdrops in the studios, of sitters having their portraits taken in the studios, and they weren't really concentrating on me because they were having an identity portrait taken for another purpose. Scenes and little details round and about around Suva. And Cacao Street is the street in Suva where my father grew up. So it's really looking at his house where he grew up, which is now empty because everyone had left at that point. And I got into the family house when there was nobody living there, just a couple of mice, and sort of lying on the floor photographing, and this mice running around. But it was a wonderful privilege to be in what was essentially my grandmother's house as well. So there was a lot of emotion there for me to be able to work in that space. And at the same time, I filmed, and I made films around these sort of like curtains blowing in the breeze in the house. And that piece is actually on my website, so you can have a look at it. But I just wanted to talk about this beach, because it's where a ship called the Syria sank, and it was one of the indenture ships, and there were like 40 ships of indenture. That obviously the ships in those days were used for different purposes, to transport goods as well as people, but there are 40 that were used in the indenture trade to Fiji. And so I was looking at all of these different ships and investigating them. And I went to this beach, and it's where a ship sank and many people died. And, obviously bodies washed up on the beach. Some survived, and they were helped by the local village as well, which is really lovely. And the villagers there talked to me, and they said, at night you can still hear voices screaming in the trees. And I thought that was just very touching. And there's a graveyard there where people who died on this ship when it wrecked were buried. And so this apparently idyllic beach, it looks paradisical, especially from where I am now over in the UK. But there's this, much more troubled and tragic history going on within this space. And this contrast, something that's really fascinated me. And because I'm working on shipwrecks now over here, I think that piece was very significant in sort of making me think about the empire and its, problematic and at times conflicted nature. So yeah, these are just stills from that work. I just flick through these.
I love Cacao Street. Like, I think I feel like it's the work that sort of, well, like that's the work that kind of introduced me to your practice, but also like it's like when I was curating Bittersweet, which contained the moving image work, my 4-year-old niece said that she only liked your work and nobody else.
Thank you.
Which is high praise from her. I'm yet to receive similar praise.
Oh, thank you.
But there was like a dress that she was particularly besotted.
Yes. Oh, you sent me a photo. That's a lovely picture. Yeah, well, I should mention that this is actually very significant, because this is my grandmother's mirror. It's her dressing table. And over the years, I'd seen pictures of brides dressing up in front of a mirror, a beautiful round mirror, and they obviously just before the wedding, the photographer would do this image, often one of the Prasad brothers. And then I was in the house alone, and I walked into one of the bedrooms, and there it was. It was still there. And, you could imagine I had shivers in my spine. And so, I started photographing this mirror. And at the same time, I also filmed a sequence with one of my relatives, and she was talking about how they used to flash a mirror to cross a river to see her relatives on the other side. See her mother, I think it was, on the other side of the river. And so I asked her to recreate that story for me in the garden, and it was beautiful, a really lovely sequence. And so I really got into this idea of mirrors. And later on, I went on to combine the work I'd shot in Fiji with footage I'd shot in India. And I was trying to create this conversation between the two, and this work, 40 ships, and this is shot in Auckland. And that was really lovely for me. And that's something that I'm still working on with stills, is a large book project where I'm trying to combine the two. so that you don't know whether you're in one place or the other, in a way.
Yeah.
You know, movement
I mean, I think
between
there is something really interesting about this idea of mirroring or trying to reflect that comes through consistently in the work that you've been producing, this idea of like, and I guess also like, again, I think it is another type of reclamation, like a kind of like understanding that in the mirror there is a different history that's being shown, not just the one that's like on the surface, but I guess the one that's also being reflected. And one of the things that I really like there are these sort of small threads that kind of keep pushing through in the works that you're producing. Like one thing, like they don't sit, they sort of sit it like in a, like they sort of lead on to, like there's almost kind of like a looping into and a retrieval and then like kind of pushing forward that keeps occurring, which I really yeah
I like that, where an element of one work can then appear in the next, you know, because it's all really one body of work in some ways. And you know, when I was in India, it was weird because I mean it was wonderful. I had a great opportunity to go there. I had an Asia Link residency, and I went to Kolkata, which is the port that Indians were transported from. I went to Varanasi in the north, which is around the area that I think my grandmother's family comes from. And but I was, you know, I didn't know whether I belonged. I mean, I felt wonderful to lots of Indian people. I was like, these are my people. But then in a way, they looked at me and thought I looked European, you know. So, you know, it was kind of very confusing. But so I wanted to be part of the community, but I knew I didn't really. I sat outside of it, you know. And but I didn't want to exotify it at the same time, you know. So I found filming into mirrors with the people walking by, just picking up a bit of street life, was a great way of me exploring that feeling of belonging and not belonging, because there's an intervening surface. So the film sequence on the right there's lots of people walking by and looking into the mirrors. It's a mirror shop in a market. So there's lots of life, lots of people walking past them. And I found that a really good device for exploring that feeling the way that I was feeling at the time.
I was wondering if you felt, I've spent some time in India, and I was thinking that the more time I spent in India, the more Fijian I felt. I don't know if this is something that you experienced. It kind of made me understand the kind of like feeling that, oh, actually I think I am part of, like while I understand I come from this place and that my body has ties to here, it feels it's not who I am.
I know. Well, I think my relationship is probably even more complicated than yours, but you know, I did really love being there. It was challenging, but really interesting on so many levels, and very, very inspiring. You know, I've only been once, and you know, I really hope that I can go back at some point. But there's more to be done there. But what I found was wonderful was talking to people on the streets. And I was filming with a tripod, and people asked me what I'm doing, and I explained, particularly in Varanasi, I explained that I was looking for my ancestors, and everyone understood that. They got it straight away. It was a pilgrimage, you know, and everyone is very used to the idea of a pilgrimage, particularly there. And so I had so much support from people bringing me cups of tea on a tray in the street, you know. So and just really, it was wonderful, amazing. Having lived mostly in Australia or the UK all of my life, you know, it was Anyway, moving right along, coming up to, because we're running out of time, coming up to the present. So I've been working on this project, Paradise Lost. You're supposed to be keeping me on time, Shivanjani.
We're having a conversation as well. We're doing it. It's okay.
No, we are doing it. It's good. It's a nice way to do it. So at the moment, I am living near Plymouth, which I've provided a little map for you there because people might not know Plymouth. It's in the southwest of England. It's very significant. There's an oldie worldy map there. It is what they call Plymouth Sound. It's a harbour. It's a very deep harbour. Now it has a breakwater. It's very protected, but previously I think it had some very wild weather. So a lot of ships sank actually in the harbour. So it's thought to be over 600 of these kind of old sailing ships, and also ships from World War II and various other periods. The history of, you know, the archaeology of shipwrecks in Plymouth goes back to the pre-Roman times. But Plymouth is very significant for us to think about, because it was the place from which people like Captain Cook sailed in the Endeavour for the first time. There's a house that is still standing on the harbour, which is where he had his last dinner with Joseph Banks, etc., before he left. And so I came over here for a teaching job. You can see behind me. But I am just fascinated by the history of the place, and the fact that, having done all this work in the Pacific and in India, I'm now kind of at the heart of empire and the belly of the beast, if you like, and kind of tracing, you know, where all these ships sailed from to other parts of the world. And I know that those indenture ships, as well as slave ships, and other parts of the empire in the colonial period, were operating from, would have come through Plymouth. It was a major port. So Darwin sailed from here. There was ships of exploration, as well as commerce, as well as navy, all of that. And I started thinking, you know, from my thinking about shipwrecks before, how, you know, the shipping was a powerhouse of empire, and it was very powerful. But at the same time, there's a vulnerability there. You know, one mistake and it goes down, and people die. You know, and you lose a whole cargo. Your cargo might be people, but it also could be goods. You know, it's absolutely ruinous stuff, and that's why the insurance industry made so much money over here. So that's, you know, a whole interesting part of the growth of capitalism, the growth of globalization through colonialism came through the ship. But at the same time, there is this vulnerability. So I started looking at that. You know, what is the weakness in the underbelly here that makes something catastrophic and you know, just turns just like that. And so I was really interested in that. So thinking about the powerful, having mistakes, having flaws, and vulnerability in a way. And you know, also sailors from the UK died as well. A lot of working class sailors died. There were whole villages in Cornwall where all of the menfolk were wiped out, and just the women and children left, and they were just like, you know, totally bereft. So you can imagine this is an enterprise that exploits workers from everywhere. It's not just from India. You know, it's more global than that. And I suppose I've expanded my work from looking very intensely at the family to looking at the bigger picture, perhaps, although I think it's still very personal. So these are just shots of the installation, which is in the gallery here. It's called the Mirror Gallery, and it's part of Plymouth College of Art. And so I'll just flick through these. I've been working in collaboration with an archaeological team called the Ships Project. Yeah. So they've been helping me find objects in various collections, both museum collections and amateur divers as well, because divers from here for the last 60 years or so have been going down and plucking stuff off the wrecks. The archaeologists try and work with them to potentially collect them into collections, or at least catalogue and understand what's happened and what's there. The object on the left is really interesting because it's a slave manila, and I don't know if any of you know, but these were used as currency to buy slaves in Africa. So, you know, this represents a life, basically. It's made of copper, it's very heavy, and copper was very prized, apparently, in Africa. It's quite a chilling object to hold. It's cold to the touch, and it's quite heavy. And that was found in Plymouth. So we know that these slave ships were going through Plymouth. And on the right is a jug that's been completely crushed by the forces of wrecking. And so I've been, you know, kind of working with the whole production team. We've been doing both photography and moving image, and working with archaeologists. And the archaeologists want to study objects in one way, and kind of I want to make artwork that's, you know, uses imagination and concepts in a slightly different way, but we're kind of working together, providing each other with different audiences and different conversations. So that's been really nice.
So I think we're very fast approaching the end. So I was just wondering if we could reflect on, I guess, something that I've been thinking about throughout this whole conversation, which is like, what does it mean to be an islander but on the wrong island?
Yeah.
Because I think it kind of circles back to like all of the things that we've been touching on, indenture, Vietnamese history, the removal of our stories from this history, the idea of but also the I guess the lack of accountability by the sites and the history that's also held in these places. Like, it is not lost on me that, you know, the labor law that enabled indentured Indians to remain in Fiji is an Australian labor law. It's called the Queensland Act, and that the ships that sailed come from Plymouth. All of these things are interconnected, and so it's like, yeah, like I was just kind of curious about your response to that.
I think, yeah, we're obviously in a process of decolonizing things at the moment, decolonizing histories, decolonizing institutions. And for me, that's about adding richness to the narrative, adding different voices and different stories. And it can be even that, even just adding further threads to the tapestry of history is very, very challenging for some people. You know, so we have to remind ourselves that a lot of histories and experiences are suppressed, and just unearthing them is almost enough as a strategy. And, you know, but I think my work attempts to go beyond that and actually unpick the mechanisms of colonialism. And I try to do that through a personal response. So I try to draw the audience in through emotion. So, for example, Paradise Lost Project has this beautiful song by Mashumi Baumik, in Kolkata, where she's singing a lament for lost souls, and that's inclusive of the lost souls over here as well as in India and Fiji and places like that. It's it's trying to, I think, you know, draw people into a sense of a shared experience of tragedy as much as anything else, which is about class as well as race, you know, and well, gender, you know, is probably something that I've tackled only indirectly, but I think it's there in my work. The sexualized nature of these kinds of ethnographic images of Indian women, for example, I've only just really scratched the surface of what you could think about there. Before we end, I really should mention Belated. There's a wonderful autograph of so recently supported me, commissioned me to make this work. And like the work I've just shown you here, it was made during lockdown, and it was a very reflective time, very indoorsy. And the only thing I could do was go for walks along the River Dart, which is just near where I live, in Devon, which is a very beautiful and special place. And so it's either indoors looking at your archive and your collection and contemplating your work, or going out for a very treasured walk, or maybe even a swim if it's nice weather, in the river. And it has a really amazing history. The Dartington Estate, which is near where I live in Totnes, which I kind of wanted to explore, but also the town of Totnes. The church bells went silent. So I'm looking at a very typical English town, you know, market town. Well, Totnes is quite untypical in some ways. It's quite alternative. So we looked at the work of Rabindranath Tagore, the Indian poet who came over and stayed at Dartington near here, and really influenced the philosophy of Dartington as being this place that explored sustainability and agriculture and art and the arts and craft movement and the, you know, creativity together. And he also wrote a lot of well, I'm not a Tagore scholar, but I'm just, you know, dipped in, but he wrote beautifully about rivers and, you know, the river as a kind of metaphor for life, mortality. Also, there's this kind of sensuality and desire in his work, which is kind of interesting. And because he spent time at Dartington, I decided to use his writing and his work in making this piece, which is based in the church tower where the bells had fallen silent. And it's a very still movie. So the shots are like still images almost, and just exploring that that stillness that happened. The first lockdown was very severe. We were hardly leaving the house at all. And it was just odd that things like the church bells were silent. And I just wanted to explore that empty space. And then my cousin Lalita in Brisbane did a beautiful choreographed and performed a beautiful dance set to Tagore's work. There's a particular kind of dance to Tagore, and so she performed that, and we filmed it over Zoom. and then projected that into the tower, and then created this dance piece where she's almost like the princess in the tower dancing. So the ankle bells that she was wearing to do this dance almost replace the bells of the tower. So it's about the insertion of this, I guess, Indian culture into this classic English setting in a way. So I'm kind of being a little bit playful with this, but it was a nice counterpoint to making the work about the shipwrecks, I think, because it's all happened in the same year or two. For me, it's been like incredibly busy time, and yeah, really nice way of kind of exploring that feeling that we had, I think, during lockdown. And that I brought in, Mishimi was reading the poem from Kolkata, my cousin Alita was reading from Brisbane, dancing from Brisbane, and I was in Totnes working with a filmmaker and editor that I'm very close to. And so, you know, I had these lovely relationships with women all around the globe at this time that we were really cut off from everybody, but we were actually really connected by the internet. And you know, and we kind of made the most of that. So I think I'll end my slides there, because actually I think that's kind of,
yeah, I think that's a nice way to kind of end the
yeah.
conversation as well.
Mm.
To kind of think about this idea of connection and being able to persevere in strange times.
Yeah. Yes. You know, yeah, I think we're at the end of the
I think we are. So I just wanted to sort of take a moment to thank you again for this conversation, Mohini, and to also thank Autograph as well as Photo 2022 and the Photo Live series. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.